there's a very good chance you're going to come across this today. So I wanted to get it done this morning. I woke up at like 2:45 for some stupid reason, and I started working on this. So whatever level of polish my presentations usually have, this is going to be like a couple notches. What's that? Yeah, it's fresh. So the objective today is less to give you like a really technical discussion on this topic, but I want, what is an arborist? An arborist is part trapeze artist, part horticulturalist, part forester, part botanist. There are a lot of fields that kind of intersect what we do. And I feel within production, there's a heavy emphasis on like the trapeze portion, you know, the aerial acrobatics. That's where I think that's what really cements a lot of guys in this industry. But I think what the public expects of us is they expect us to like know things about trees as well, not just to be able to manipulate them. And I find a huge amount of satisfaction in seeing some weird ass shit on trees and you're like, I know what that is. And it's even better when someone asks you like, hey, do you know what this is? And you're like, yeah, this is what this is. It feels really good. And so that is the goal of today's presentation. It's not going to change how you climb. It's not going to change your risk assessments. It's just going to be like, what is that weird ass thing? I actually know a little bit about it. So that's the goal. This is a reference to a 1970s horror film called The Stuff. I spent an hour and a half manipulating this photo to be orange instead of green. So let's take a moment to appreciate my 2:45 coffee-fueled photo editing attempt. We're talking about rusts. Anyone have, can anyone name a rust? There's one I know you all have seen.
Cedar apple.
Yeah. Cedar apple rust. Yeah.
Cedar.
Apple cedar.
So we're going to briefly touch on that, but our focus is going to be on a different one for a little bit. All right.
Fusiform. What is it?
Yeah, Fusiform is another rust.
Yeah,
nice.
there we go.
So kind of an overview of rusts. Rusts are really, really complicated fungal organisms. We've covered the terms multiple times, but you know, monoecious and dioecious, referring to like one or two houses. With rust, we have the terms autoecious and heteroecious. Most rusts are heteroecious, meaning their life cycle requires more than one host to complete. And we're not talking about more than one like individual. We're talking about more than one host from different like families of plants. And they can produce, so these are fungi. They're not going to show up as like a mushroom. You like my cheat sheet shirt I'm wearing today? We haven't done like a fungal Friday or a mycology Monday. And so I was really excited about this, so I wore my mushroom shirt. But so rusts, most rusts that you're going to encounter are heteroecious, meaning they're bouncing back and forth between a few different hosts. For the ones that we're going to be talking today, juniper is the primary host. That's usually what's going to be causing repeated infections. And for most of the rusts we're coming across within the genus Gymnosporangium, which includes cedar apple rust, it's going to be juniper and then members of the rose family, Rosaceae, which includes everything from apples, pears, hawthorn, crab apples, service berries. It's a huge family. They are indigenous. So they're native to North America, unlike emerald ash borer or chestnut blight or Dutch elm disease. These are things that have been a part of North America for a long time. It's a normal part. They can cause widespread, especially economic damage, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Yeah, highly complex. They're specialized. They oftentimes affect very specific hosts. There are a lot of different types of rusts. And some rusts are autoecious, as I mentioned. One that if you are out in a natural area this weekend, there's a good chance you'll come across if you're looking at May-apples. Does everyone know what May-apples are?
No.
They stand about maybe like 6 to 12 inches off the ground. Yeah, they look like a large clover, kind of umbrella shaped. Sometimes they've got two umbrellas coming off of one stem. But there is a rust that I saw yesterday that is specific to May-apples, and it's autoecious, meaning it only requires May-apple to complete its life cycle. It forms these kind of orange cups on the underside of leaves. So that's one that you can see in the landscape. What's crazy about rusts is they have up to 4 different kinds of spore-producing forms, and they can produce up to 5 spores. To put that into context, maybe in language that's more relatable, it would be like, let's say you have an oak. The oak produces an acorn. You plant the acorn. It grows a cherry tree. The cherry tree grows cherries. the cherry seed gets planted. It becomes a pine tree. The pine tree grows pine cones. The pine seeds are dispersed. The seed lands. It grows an oak tree. Like, we're talking about like this level of complexity. They are really fascinating, bizarre organisms. And in our case, they're also really interesting. What people are going to notice is that they cause plant deformities. There's some really interesting galls. One of my favorites, it's so alien looking, we'll get a photo here in a minute, but the cedar apple rust is one of the most bizarre looking things you'll see. And it is everywhere in the, if it's like spring or early summer when it starts to show up. But you'll know, every juniper in town is gonna have these like bizarre looking galls. And we'll get to that in a second. But there are also some really bizarre galls associated with Fusiform rust, which we're also gonna cover a little bit, which is more of like a Virginia pine, loblolly pine thing. And then, or they'll also just show up as bands of like really goopy stuff, which we are going to talk about now. So this is a close-up of that Mayapple rust. So you see those tiny, tiny little cups. All right, so we covered that first part, Gymnosporangium, which is the genus to which the cedar apple rust belongs. And it is also the genus to another significant rust called Gymnosporangium clavipes or Quince Rust, which is what I think that you have a really good chance of seeing today on junipers, so keep your eyes peeled. It shows up as these bands of like really orange gelatinous goop, either on the main trunk of a juniper, or you'll even see it along small twigs. Is anyone seen this?
Yes.
Yeah, really, really common right now. It'll be visible for maybe a couple days, but it dries out fairly quickly.
And that's different from the cedar apple.
And that's different from cedar apple, yeah. It's actually more virulent to its rosaceous hosts, rosaceae, than cedar apple.
Hey Sam?
Yeah,
When this is not actively blooming,
yeah.
does it leave like a darkened patch on the bark where it looks like a deer peed on it?
Great question. Is this what you're talking about?
Yes.
Wow.
I have been trying to figure this out for a long time. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is what it looks like when it's dry. Here we still can see some evidence of the teliospores, which is what the orange things are. It's a structure that releases spores. And they gelatinize when it's wet. Let's find, I've got it. Okay, so this is what it looks like when it's gelatinized. This is what I hope you see today. Super bizarre. It's gonna jump out right away. And then you can see it along that twig there. But it's most obvious when it's on the main stem. But when it dries out, it leaves kind of, there will be a section of the stem that's got flakier bark and it's darker in color. And the reason why I'm confident this is that is because we still have some remnants of those teliospores. If you look closely, there's some orange highlights along the edge. And this will actually increase incrementally year by year, a couple centimeters.
Any control for that?
We'll get to that. Yeah, great question. All right. One of the fun things about Gymnosporangium clavipes or Quince rust is it's really only common in the eastern states. So as arborists in the south, this is something that we're going to have more exposure to than arborists in like the western United States. So what does it mean to be an arborist in the southeast? Well, knowing this is, I think, part of what makes being an arborist in the southeast kind of fun. Interestingly, it can impair the winter hardiness of junipers, especially younger junipers. I read a section from the Pathology Bible, the diseases of plants and shrubs, that in one particularly bad infection, like in the 70s or something it was referencing, there was widespread juniper dieback. So from junipers that had the Quince rust, and some studies kind of, showed that it decreases their winter hardiness. Kind of interesting there. In terms of what it does to the juniper host or the primary host, juniper, I mean eastern red cedar. Out west, we tend to just call them junipers, but eastern red cedar here. It'll cause leaf and twig dieback, but that's usually happening over a period of like 4 to 6 years. I didn't read anything whether it will cause full mortality in junipers, but you will see some dieback. And then a lot of the cultivars of eastern red cedar, I don't know how much those cultivars are planted here, but out west there are a lot of cultivars of eastern red cedar planted. They tend to be more disease resistant. All right, so cover that. And it is bouncing back and forth between, oh yeah, I already mentioned that. Like I said, today is going to be a little bit more rusty. All right, so here's unintentional pun. So this is what it looks like on 2 examples of an alternate host. This is Bradford pear. On the left, I saw this last year. So you get these kind of like long, you get these elongating horns that are also orange in color that show up on the fruit, especially. On leaves, it's not always orange. It'll be kind of an orange cast, but there are also these black acea, just another type of fungal structure and spore, like on the underside of the leaves. On the top, you'll just see kind of like a chlorotic, yellowish, maybe orange spot where the green has been interrupted. So really, really interesting
Is this
looking
Quince or Cedar
organism.
apple?
This is Quince, or Quince. Do you say Quince?
I do, but I don't know if
Oh,
I'm right.
yeah. And so this organism is changing as it's going back and forth. So it's a different type of structure, and it's producing a different type of spore when it's on juniper versus when it's on its rosaceous host. Or the rosaceous, I just mean anything belonging to that family Rosaceae. All right, so this is the cedar apple rust. Has anyone not seen this before? Okay, so you're all familiar with this. I hadn't seen this before I moved out here. I was really excited. My first spring here, every time it rained, I was out looking at junipers, and I have a million photos on my phone from when this finally happened. But this is what it looks like when those teleal horns have dried out, and then eventually even those will kind of blow off, and you'll just be left with these apple-looking things, hence the name cedar apple rust. So for cedar apple rust, it's going to be pretty similar the way it shows up on its host to the previous photos we looked at. But yeah, these kind of like lesions, orangish spots with black centers. So this one's much better known, and it's a lot easier to identify than the Quince Rust. One of the interesting things I learned about cedar apple rust is, I don't know when this happened. It mentioned this within that landscape disease or diseases of trees and shrubs manual. I don't know when this happened or which states it affected, but there were some laws enacted. One of the few instances where there was actual regulation put in place by the government to control the spread of a disease. This is a really important disease when it comes to orchards, especially apple orchards. And so what the laws stated was that all eastern red cedars within a certain distance of these orchards had to be removed. It's really the only effective cultural control, but we're talking about a distance of like 4 to 5 miles in a radius around that you have to remove. And so it pissed off a lot of the neighbors to these orchards who had these ornamental or valuable from a timber perspective these cedars removed. Fungicidal control is really time intensive. Applications have to be done like every 7 to 14 days through that first crop of apples, and so it's one of the reasons why you'll probably find very few tree companies that are like offering this as a control. It's really, really both time of year intensive, very specific time of year, and then a lot of repeated applications. And then, like I said, cultural control, not a lot of great options there. This is relevant from an arboricultural perspective. I was advising a client who had some really, really old junipers, beautiful trees, and then they had some dinky little like apple trees. And they're like, we value the apple trees, and they were growing for fruit production. They're like, we want to remove the junipers because they were getting cedar apple rust. And I just said, it's not going to do anything because you would have to like remove your neighbor's junipers and your neighbor's junipers. It's just not going to be effective to just remove these beautiful eastern red cedars that you have to help out these apple trees that you planted a few weeks ago. So I discourage them from doing that.
I'm gonna go to a Capitol Hill board meeting, put it on as a proposal.
Oh yeah. Let's just get rid of all the junipers. And as a reminder, junipers are very economically or ecologically important. They produce berries during the winter. It provides berries. They're like fleshy cones, but birds like cedar waxwing especially eat those little cones. So these are trees that are participating in an important way, like within our ecology. So not trees that you want to haphazardly just extirpate from the landscape. So one of the other rusts that I find really interesting from a visual perspective that it took me forever to figure out what this was, and so I am sharing a year's worth of looking around different books and online information with you, so when you see it, you know what it is. If a client ever asks you what it is, you can give them a quick answer. And it does some really weird stuff. Like, I find this picture on the right hilarious. I don't think I need to explain why, but it's not too uncommon. I see, so this is Cronardium quersum, or pine oak gall rust, also called Fusiform rust. There are some subspecies, there's some variation, but fundamentally, yeah, pine oak gall rust, and it's just referring the two hosts that this is bouncing between, loblolly, Virginia pine especially, and then oaks. It's going to be, lesions on the undersides of oak leaves, and then on pine trees it can form galls, but it can also form cankers on the main stem. And then I've got an example here from, obviously not active, there aren't any of the teliospores, but kind of give you an example of what to look for on Virginia pine. And what the galls look like on the main stem is this kind of like really bizarre banded kind of opening, and that's what I saw that really perplexed me. I sent that around, no one really knew what it was, and then I finally found some photos in this Diseases of Trees and Shrubs. It's an absolutely phenomenal book.
How large those can be?
Yeah, I've seen them, up to like a foot long, and then they can be as wide as the stem. In fact, they'll even blow out the sides of the stem, in the same way like a perennial canker would. Where you have as the canker expands each year, it's producing like a line where it kills the tissue. Also called Nectria cankers. Anyone know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Anyways, another discussion for another time. Fusiform means spindle shaped, which is referring to especially the way that the galls appear on younger branches. If you walk around Duke Forest, you'll see plantations of loblolly pine, and it is really, really common in these plantations. You'll see these kind of spindle-shaped galls on the young branches. And then the last photo on the right is kind of showing, a tree with numerous infections. I believe that sunken depression in the center of the tree is probably an area of active rust infection, and then you see the dieback at the base of the branch. Right here, you see the formation of a gall, and then the dieback on the stem, where I believe that's a canker forming.
It's a structural concern.
It is, yeah, it is a structural concern. It weakens the stem at the point where it occurs, so Virginia pine is already susceptible to wind throw, right? Not super strong trees, so a real world example of how this affected an assessment for me, for a client, is he had some medium-sized, heavily leaning Virginia pines pointed right over his driveway with really large stem galls. In fact, this was the client here. This is one of the trees. The tree had a heavy lean towards the driveway where he was parking, so I recommended removal, as these galls are weakening the stem, so increasing the liability there. But that's basically it. My goal was for you to see these things and to have a really quick answer, a general idea of what's going on. These are really complex organisms. I'm not an expert on the topic, but if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take a shot at answering them.
Does anything like that show up on oaks?
Yeah, so it's going to look something like, no, nothing like these galls. What it's going to look like is this, some variation of this, just these chlorotic looking lesions on the undersides of leaves. I think this, my guess, I haven't seen it specifically. I don't know that I would recognize it as such if I saw it. There are a lot of things that are going to look like this. This was actually a pear tree in New York City that I found.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you.